A couple of years ago, I did a live Strip Panel Naked panel with Frank Quietly that was unfortunately not recorded, but one of the things we talked about in that was the infamous silent issue of New X-Men, issue 121. So in this episode, I want to discuss some of the things that we spoke about in that live talk and some of the approaches that Frank Quietly took on that issue to make it easily readable without the benefit of dialogue balloons, something not necessarily easy in bombastic superhero fiction, of course. But by combining a very upfront and straight line focus, panel sizing, and guiding the reader with gutters, Quietly made this approach look very easy and incredibly readable. So let's take a look in this episode at how it all came together. You're watching Strip Panel Naked, I'm Hass, and I'm going to show you some of the cool stuff lurking in the pages of some of the best comics. Okay, so New X-Men 121 has to be read and understood with essentially no balloons, save for one on the very last page. There are a couple of kind of like cheaty words in there, but essentially it has to be told wordless. And it's worth prefacing the rest of this by saying that part of the way that this works is obviously down to Grant Morrison's script, which is incredibly simple and clear in what it's doing. Two characters, Emma Frost and Jean Grey, go into the mind of another, Professor X, to understand what's going on with them, and they learn a secret about Professor X's past. That's it, that's basically the whole issue, right? Nothing else really happens. So that gives you the story room to be able to get you there without words. And as I said in the intro, this really boils down to what I would say are three clear elements. There's the composition, there's the structure, and there are the gutters. And yes, that's basically the same as any other comic, but Quietly has to be especially careful here because clarity, which is not something necessarily that superhero comics are known for, is foundational to the experience of this issue. So let's start with the composition and then we'll bring everything else in as we go. Almost everything takes place directly in the center of the panel, no matter what panel, no matter what page, and mostly in the foreground. And you can really do this across almost every single page. There's one instance of a kind of circular approach as they go into the mind of Professor X that breaks this, but essentially every other of the 22-23 pages of this issue all work in this exact same way. If it's important, it falls down the central line. Now, I've spoken a lot in the past about eye lines in pages, but I've also spoken about research that shows that readers gravitate primarily from balloon to balloon. They go from text and they focus on text. So Quietly doesn't have that luxury here, and instead he can only rely on his own framing. And I can pick any page, as I said, from this issue and show you that clear focus. So here's the first page as Emma and Jean are actually inside Professor X's head. There's a splash page, and if I put a line straight down the middle, it shows you everything you need to see. And Quietly even blocks the left and right sides out in shadow to make that as clear and streamlined as possible. The light does hit a stone face on the left side, which comes back into it in the next page and later on in the issue, but equally that doesn't complicate or muddy the rest of the composition, which is still very clear. And a few pages later we see a series of horizontally stacked panels, and rather than having Jean move left to right through the page as you might often expect, the panels actually just track with her. So the background shifts and we see her moving from left to right in that space, but the central point of the panel is always Jean. It zooms out, but Jean stays in the middle, straight along the line that begins with Emma in panel 1. It's almost impossible to lose your way on this page. There's no left to right movement from panels in the same tier, there's no balloons moving you left to right throughout the panels, there's just straight top to bottom reading order. All you have to do on this page to understand it is look straight down the middle. Okay, but what about the pages that aren't just splash pages or stacked horizontal pages, I hear you ask, because these are the easy ones? Well, the same thing happens there too. Here's one of Jean getting into X's history on a 6-panel page. The gutters are thick and clear, clearly delineating moments of time. It's very hard to confuse any one panel with another, none of them bleed across from each other, and almost everything else is left out of these panels. Each image is doing only one thing, right? So Jean shows the figure, there's a close-up of the figures, there's a reaction shot of X clearly thinking about that, Jean swimming with sperm, Jean stopping and looking, and then the reveal of what she's looking at. It's all really simple stuff. And it's much more complicated narratively this page than previous examples because there is that back and forth, but it's still kept straight down the middle in each panel and only one clear action and moment in each of those panels, all delineated by that very clear and direct structure and those thick, clear gutters. And the reason this works so well is what we're discussing here is just pure foundational elements of comics, right? Simplicity and clarity as fundamental points of order in the approach, and the visual bombast can then be built around that. If you consider a page later in the issue where the tower from the previous splash that I showed you just disintegrates around Jean, who's left floating in the air. This is to me an example of a page that is impossible to get lost in, working clearly from left to right. The focal point of each panel is yet again straight down the middle of it. And the pink glow by Hi-Fi did the colours aiding in that. And yet this is a stunning, bombastic sequence to me, right? The transition from panel 3 to panel 4 is incredible. The wide shot to this close-up, the full height of the page suddenly on this panel, the clear skies, there's depth to the storytelling, right? The muddied brain of X being cleared by Jean's new understanding of it, but also just the beauty of the composition, running this silhouetted castle and stormy skies against the cleanliness of the biggest panel on the page, the final image. And it's both beautiful to look at and it's beautiful storytelling. I mean, this is the work of someone who understands how far you have to go to make something clear, but when you break down the simplicity of this page, it's absolutely wonderful. There is very, very few things on each of those images, but they're all just enough to work against each other and build up to that final image. And it's just enough of a juxtaposition from panel 3 to panel 4 to really sell the strength of that. And yet, by having very little in those panels and very little to bog those panels down, the clarity just sings through and it's effortlessly readable. But let's look at something slightly more complicated than this, and this is probably about as complicated as you get in this issue, which is a 4-panel page showing Professor X and his twin in the womb fighting. So there's Jumble Panels, right? This is really one of the only instances apart from the page where they first go into X's head, where there's kind of a different setup to the rhythm. So there's Jumble Panels, they're tilted, the central focus point doesn't even really exist in these panels. But let's go back again to these foundational comic approaches, right? There is a left to right reading order to the page. You go left to right, left to right, left to right, and very much that reverse S pattern that most comics work by. Even though they are jumbled, it's still impossible to get lost in this page, and the reason why is because Quietly does something very, very simple by overlapping the edge of one corner of the panel into another. So each panel connects to one panel next. So the first panel has one overlap from panel 2, and panel 2 overlaps into panel 3 overlaps into panel 4. There is just a clear line that you can go through. So as soon as you go into one panel, there's only one way out of that panel into the next panel. And there's only one way out of that panel into the next panel. So even when Quietly does something that breaks the order a little bit and kind of does something a little bit more bombastic, arguably, it's still incredibly clear and readable because he's making it so it's impossible to get lost. And here's the secret to this too, right? When you go back through Quietly's work on New X-Men, there's not really much difference in this issue than in any other issue that he draws. Some of the compositions can be a little bit more dense as Morrison writes more into each image, and they're both confident that the balloons, will add whatever clarity it needs to. But the central points around the kind of central framing, the thick gutters, the simple compositions that places most things in the foreground, they're all there in almost every single page of his work across all of New X-Men. And that's the point I wanted to make in this episode, really. More so than talking about this as a silent issue that Quietly kind of cleverly navigates, he navigates all of his comics, quiet or not quiet, in exactly the same way. And I think that's how you know a comic artist is a good comics artist, and I want to put the emphasis on the word comics there. The fact that Quietly, faced with the challenge of making a comic entirely readable and understandable without dialogue, had to essentially do nothing different, nothing that he wouldn't ordinarily do in any of the other more wordy versions of the New X-Men, shows his clear and total grasp on how to manage sequential storytelling. Because ultimately comics is about storytelling. That's what makes, to me, a great comic artist. So if you want to get a sense of how to tell a story visually, Frank Quietly in this issue of New X-Men, but honestly in most of Frank Quietly's work across all of his comics and different series, this is a great place to start because ultimately it shows how Quietly has control over his approach, control over the medium, and control specifically over you as the reader to tell you what you need to know and get you from start to finish in an orderly and yet exciting fashion. Thanks for watching. If you're a fan of Strip Panel Naked, you can support the channel on Patreon, where you'll currently get access to years and years worth of extra articles, annotations, and reading lists. You can also grab the magazine I edit at panelxpanel.com, and if you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm there at HassanOE. Finally, hit subscribe and the notification bell to keep up to date with all the latest episodes, and I will see you next time.